1984, 19-year-old Timothy Molnar was living at home with his parents in Daytona Beach, Florida, while going to school for aeronautical mathematics. On January 24th, Timothy gets up and begins his day just like every other day of the work week by going downstairs, having a bite to eat, and then taking his younger brother Frank to school. Once he dropped Frank off, he drove across town to his university where he had class, but as soon as he parked, he realized he had forgotten his bike. He went back home, he got his bike, put it in his car, turned around, and headed out. That night, when Tim didn't come home, his family called the police. The police asked them, is there any reason he would want to run away? And his family's like, no. He's a straight-A student. He's got lots of friends. He's super happy. He's well-adjusted. He's on a great career path. The police begin their investigation. Tim had a credit card that was connected to the family account. And they found there had been a charge placed the same day he had gone missing in a gas station about 150 miles away. The police go out to this gas station and they find someone that had been there when Tim was there. And the witness says, yeah, he was alone. He was acting totally normal. For the next couple of days, nothing really happened. There were no leads to operate on and Tim wasn't getting in touch with them, so they just waited. But a week after Tim has gone missing, Tim's family receives a letter from an auto impound company in Atlanta, Georgia. There is a car that's sitting in our lot that is registered to your house. So the family goes to Atlanta, Georgia to inspect the car and they walk up to it and there's nothing suspicious about it. But what they would find inside the car were Tim's credit cards, his wallet, his license, and other items suggesting that perhaps Tim is trying to ditch his old identity and start a new one. Tim's family stayed in Atlanta for a couple of days. After a couple of days, it was clear that they weren't doing any good sitting there, so they went back to Florida, and they never ever heard about him again. It was like he just vanished. A decade after Tim went missing, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Timothy and his disappearance in hopes that the viewers would be able to give them some information about the case. And sure enough, a man named Stephen Cull, who was living in Wisconsin, called into the show and said, without a doubt, I know where Timothy is. 10 years earlier, he was walking around this forested area in Wisconsin when he came to a clearing in the middle of this forest, and he saw this lump in the middle of the ground, and he looked down and he realized it was this huge block of ice. Inside is the dead body of a young man. Cull would immediately call the police, who would show up. They would get the body out of the ice, but there was no identifying information on him, and he was very badly decomposed at this point, and so they had no way to identify him. When the TV show Unsolved Mysteries put a picture of Tim up on the screen saying, if you've seen this guy, let us know, Steven's like, oh my gosh, I recognize those clothes. The police go to Wisconsin, they dig up the body that was inside of the ice, they do a DNA test, and sure enough, it's Tim Molnar. However, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. To this day, we have no idea how or why Tim wound up 1,200 miles away, frozen inside of a block of ice. In 1999, when Daniel was 27, he joined a small religious community of people that practiced Hare Krishna, which is a branch of Hinduism. They get their name from their chant that devotees repeat over and over again. During his stay with this community, Daniel basically blew off all of his responsibilities. He didn't really practice the religion, he didn't help out around the temple. Instead, he spent virtually all of his time feeding the wild birds that came to roost inside of the temple's garden. All he cared about were these birds. After a month of living in the Hare Krishna community, Daniel abruptly tells the other worshippers that he's going to be taking a vow of silence. And this really confused the others because Hare Krishna does not encourage its members to take vows of silence. This was something Daniel was just going to do on his own. And so right before he took his vow of silence, he also informed them that he would be leaving. So he takes his vow of silence, he packs his stuff up, and he leaves. After departing, Daniel committed a series of petty offenses through South Carolina, Washington, Texas, and then ultimately in Florida. One of his offenses in Florida was stealing a candy bar at a 7-Eleven. And in court, because of his vow of silence, he had to write on a piece of paper that he denied the charge. But ultimately, he was sent to jail for 3 days. After his stint in this Florida jail, Daniel gets out and he decides he wants to go to Orlando, Florida, and go to the SeaWorld and check out the manatees as well as some other animals. When he got to the park, he made his way over to the killer whale demonstration, and witnesses said they remember seeing Daniel in the stands watching the show, being fascinated with what he was looking at. But apparently Daniel's biggest reaction to any part in the show was when the trainers brought out Tilikum, the biggest killer whale ever held in captivity, measuring over 22 feet long and weighing over 12,000 pounds. Daniel was just totally taken with Tilikum. So that night, after the park shut down and everyone went home, Daniel came back, now wearing a bathing suit. He hops the fence and he sneaks back into SeaWorld, and somehow he managed to go through the park without being picked up on a camera, and he makes his way over to the killer whale enclosure. He hops the fence and he jumps into the massive pool with Tilikum. And apparently Tilikum was really eager to play with Daniel, because Tilikum quickly played with Daniel by biting his shorts and bringing him to the bottom of the pool and dragging him along the bottom until Daniel drowned. And then after he drowned, Tilikum basically thrashed him around, throwing him up and down, ripping off pieces of him, until finally he draped Daniel's body over his back, and that's where Tilikum kept him. The next day, when the staff showed up and made this discovery, they couldn't get Daniel's body away from Tilikum because Tilikum wanted to keep his toy. And so they had to use a special medical hoist to lift Tilikum up into the air to recover Daniel's body. All right, so it seems like you guys really liked it when I hid a copy of our new book that was signed in that Walmart in Tennessee. You guys found it in 9 minutes. And so we decided, in the spirit of keeping things fun, we would expand this book scavenger hunt. I am, over the next couple of weeks, going to be hiding more of these books that'll be signed with a little inscription in them all over the country at different bookstores and maybe even some non-bookstore locations. In fact, tonight I plan to hide at least one of these in the general New York City area. Okay, so if you want to find out where these books are going to be, I'm going to leave clues starting tonight on my social media. So you got to follow me on Instagram and across social media. We're going to be doing this for the next couple of weeks. And if you guys like it, we'll just keep this thing going. Okay, so if you find one of these books, and you'll know you found it, there will clearly be an inscription inside, in addition to my signature, that will make it clear you have found one of these books. Make sure to take a photo or video with it and post it and tag me, because I want to reshare these Easter eggs you're finding, so to speak. All right, so I'm really excited to see who finds these books. It's going to be fun. Look for your first clue tonight. A teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the off, and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. They went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them, drove in, shut the gate, locked it. They followed this road for about 2 miles, where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They noticed that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals, silence. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They don't see a single animal. It is just completely silent. They set up their tent, and Eben's father says, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? They hike a little ways away from their campsite. They don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. As soon as they could see their campsite, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, they had been removed from the 4 corners. Either they failed to set up their tent, or someone came over to their campsite and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here, because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. We must have not made the tent. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly, and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not. Thinks he hears someone laughing a couple hundred meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is, and all he can hear is silence. He says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. He goes, shh. Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. And it's a lot closer to them. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest. And it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. So loud, they can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. Whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods. Eben and his father brother would stay up all night waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time all the way back to their truck. And they told the owner of the property about it, and the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance, and you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period, and prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. Sunday, August 27th, 2000, a 50-year-old husband and father named Bruce Leniger sat in his living room in Lafayette, Louisiana. His son, James, the 2-year-old, has his favorite toy plane, and he is repeatedly smashing it into the coffee table as loud as he can, saying, plane crash, plane crash, plane crash. Over the past few months, James had become fixated on plane crashes. James had begun having these recurring nightmares. He, James, had just been in a horrible fiery plane crash, and it was like every night. He also began to tell Bruce and his wife these weird details about the plane crash, because it was always the same plane crash in his nightmare. The Japanese shot me down. And the doctors were all like, nah, he's a kid. Yeah, it's a weird fixation he's got, but he'll grow out of it. Don't worry about it. Bruce decided he had to do something about this. And so over the next couple of months, he began leaning in and asking James to give him more information. The type of plane that James was flying in apparently was a Corsair plane. Bruce found himself sitting in the living room, and he had this World War II coffee table book full of pictures of pilots and combat and war. He called James over and he shows him this book. Towards the end of the coffee table book, he suddenly stops and he points at one of the pages and he says to his dad, that's where I was shot down. And he's pointing at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Bruce had this idea to get in touch with this old veterans group. And the historian, he tells Bruce that during that battle, there was one plane that was shot down. A single U.S. Air Force pilot was shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he was killed. And that pilot's name was James Houston Jr. They discover that James has a sister who is still alive. James and his wife, they send a message to this woman, to the sister. Her reaction was to send actual physical photographs of James Houston Jr. when he was a pilot, when he served in the military. And when Bruce looked at these photos, it was like his whole world was completely rocked. Because in one of the photos that clearly showed James Houston Jr., he is standing in front of a plane. And that plane was a Corsair plane. Periodically, his son James would talk about how he really wasn't named James. He was named James III. And now Bruce is thinking, James Houston Jr.? That's James II. My son? How could he possibly know all these things that happened to James Houston Jr. if he was not James III, James Houston Jr.'s reincarnated soul? Bruce would eventually take his son's story to the news, and the family would film a primetime segment on ABC about it. James was soon invited to the Battle of Iwo Jima Veterans Reunion, where he would shock the group with his knowledge of the battle. James also met James Houston Jr.'s sister, and when he did, he called her by a nickname that only her late brother ever used. After that, even she was convinced that her brother's spirit come back to Earth in James III. If reincarnation is real, James's story is one of the most credible and well-documented cases in history. You're on vacation in Kentucky and a local blue duck salesman approaches you and says, hey, are you interested in buying 5 blue ducks? Yeah. Give me all 5. You fool. It's illegal to purchase less than 6. You're on vacation in Idaho, and a local oversized candy salesman approaches you and says, hey, are you interested in buying a 51-pound box of candy for your fiancé? Yeah. Hit me. You fool. 50 pounds is the legal limit. We're on vacation in Indiana, and a local horse salesman approaches you and says, hey, are you interested in buying a horse that can only run at exactly 11 miles per hour? Giddy up. You fool. 10 miles per hour is the legal limit. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the mountains. 7 days in, and some bad weather forced them to make camp about halfway up a mountain. The last pictures of them alive were taken at this campsite. When the hikers never showed up, they sent out a search party who quickly found their campsite, and it was immediately apparent that something horrible had happened to them. All their tents had been slashed open, but from the inside, and inside the tents was all their gear, neatly folded and stacked inside the remains of the tents. No bodies, but 9 sets of footprints walking away from the camp. Using the footprints, they discovered 5 hikers who were only dressed in underwear who had died of hypothermia. They found the other 4 hikers 250 feet away in a riverbed wearing the clothes of their dead hiker friends. They had skull fractures, chest fractures, eyes, tongue, lips missing, and their bodies were radioactive. Official cause of death? Unknown compelling force.
One late night in the summer of 1974, a 30-year-old man named Fred stood inside of a loud casino in Las Vegas, feeling incredibly nervous. He knew what he was about to do was a horrible idea. Fred grabbed a huge wad of cash out of his pocket, and as he looked at it, he thought about the reason he was here. So Fred had actually flown to Las Vegas on a whim after a bad meeting with a group of investors. So Fred had founded this small company 3 years earlier, and he really needed a loan from these investors, but they had said no. Fred had actually already lost over $13 million to this point, and this was a huge problem for Fred, because right now, in all of his company accounts, he had a total of $5,000. He needed to pay his fuel bill for his company, which was $24,000, and that bill was due soon. And besides the fuel bill, he also didn't have any money to make payroll. And if he didn't find a way to find more money, he would have to file for bankruptcy, shut his business down, and lay off all of his employees. He totally believed in this company, but now it was about to collapse, unless he got really, really lucky. Fred didn't know if he'd be celebrating or sobbing by the end of this night. All he knew is he was out of options here. Fred began walking over to a blackjack table because someone had told him that of all the games you could play in a Las Vegas casino, the game with the best odds was blackjack. He exchanged all his cash for chips. Then Fred began to play. For the first few hands, Fred was pretty cautious, only placing small bets. But he won all those small bets, and so he began placing larger bets. And he began winning those bets too. And in fact, it got to the point where he was winning so consistently that a crowd of strangers had formed behind the table just to watch Fred. But Fred wasn't even aware of the crowd behind him. And eventually, he got to a place where he had a mountain of chips in front of him, and he was gambling huge sums of it all at once. Fred decided this was it. He was going to double down and go all in. And so he puts all these chips out, and he waits, and eventually the dealer flips over their cards, and as soon as they did, the crowd around Fred, who he hadn't even noticed to this point, erupted in cheers because Fred had just won. And when the dealer pushed all the chips back over to him and he got to count how much money he had, he realized he had started with $5,000, but now had $27,000. He had gambled and won. $27,000 was just enough to pay that fuel bill and keep his company running a little bit longer. He was able to secure $11 million in investor funding, which was enough money to finally scale up this small business into the behemoth that we know it as today. Fred went from being a guy betting his last chips at a casino to now being a multi-billionaire. Fred's full name is Fred Smith, and that little company that he scaled up on a gamble was FedEx.
In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Sam regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. This one night overnight where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. He had planned on getting there early in the day, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. But he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans, and he began eating his dinner. He started to get a sense that something was off. A rock the size of a marble lands at his feet. For the next 15 minutes, Sam is scanning the tree line. He doesn't hear anything. He doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. He starts telling himself maybe a rock fell off a tree. He got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up. He hears the sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. The sounds start to fade. He wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and he can't find his flashlight. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head. He jumps out of his his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away. Someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight while he was fast asleep, and had moved it all the way over there. Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he's gonna build the biggest fire he can, and he's not gonna go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood. As the fire died down, he hears the footsteps approaching. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees. The sun would eventually come up, and before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing turned around and ran away. He waited until it was full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had, and he sprinted back to the parking lot, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. He noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car, and he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight? April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, who was an avid outdoorsman, decided to go on a one-night hike in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Sam regularly came out here to go hiking, in particular on this 8-mile loop that went through a canyon. This one night overnight where he'd do 4 miles in, camp out, and then 4 miles back. He had planned on getting there early in the day, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, he didn't get to the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. that night. But he figured with his good health and fitness, he could probably quickly make his way to the 2 or even 3 mile mark, and there were some suitable campsites there. But he wasn't able to move as fast as he thought he could, and he's 15 miles away from the nearest help, and he's in a bad cell phone service area, and where he was, there was this forest right nearby, and he could see there was a clearing about 30 feet off the path. He liked to sleep on a sleeping pad with a sleeping bag over that, and then he would string up a tarp over the top of him in case it rained. And pretty soon he had a fire going, and then he cracked open a can of beans and he began eating his dinner. He started to get a sense that something was off. A rock the size of a marble lands at his feet. For the next 15 minutes, Sam is scanning the tree line. He doesn't hear anything. He doesn't see any more rocks get thrown. He starts telling himself maybe a rock fell off a tree. He got into his sleeping bag under his tarp and he went to sleep. A couple of hours later, Sam wakes up. He hears the sounds like someone walking through leaves about 30 or 40 meters away from his campsite. The sounds start to fade. He wanted to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction, and he can't find his flashlight. And that's when the alarm bells start going off in his head. He jumps out of his sleeping bag, he ducks out from under the tarp, and he's looking around on the ground, and in the same direction that he had heard those footsteps, he sees his flashlight laying on the ground about 10 meters away. Someone or something had been less than a foot away from him to get this flashlight while he was fast asleep, and had moved it all the way over there. Sam thinks to himself, that's a trap. So he puts his boots on and he grabs his knife, and he's gonna build the biggest fire he can, and he's not gonna go anywhere near that flashlight. For the next several hours, he would hear footsteps approach his campsite, turn around, and leave. Every time the fire got lower, he noticed they would come closer, and when he would stoke the fire, they wouldn't come as close. But at about 3 a.m., he ran out of firewood. As the fire died down, he hears the footsteps approaching. This time, they walk right up to about 3 meters away, but they intentionally come behind the thickest group of trees. The sun would eventually come up, and before it actually popped over the horizon, this thing turned around and ran away. He waited until it was full sunlight, and then he packed up everything he had, and he sprinted back to the parking lot, and he drove nonstop for 20 miles until he got to a gas station where he could park and collect himself. He noticed someone had written something on the dust on the back window of his car, and he walks over and it just says, "Sleep well?" ? Sam is confident whoever was stalking him at his campsite is the same person or group of people that wrote this message on his car. And now Sam just wonders, what would have happened if I retrieved that flashlight? In the 1960s, Alan Burkhart opened a riverfront restaurant in Beaumont, Texas. And for the next 50 plus years, his customers would eat burgers, drink beers, and on super hot days, they would jump off the pier into the river to cool down. But one day in June of 2015, while Alan was in his restaurant looking out the back window, he saw something strange in the river. Alan immediately yelled out to everyone to not go swimming, obviously, based on what they were seeing, and then he went back inside and made a sign that said no swimming, and he posted it on the pier. A few weeks weeks later, on July 2nd, a 28-year-old local man named Tommy Woodward and his girlfriend, Victoria LeBlanc, arrived at Alan's restaurant for a fun night out. After several hours of drinking and playing pool, Tommy and his girlfriend made their way over to the bar and had a seat, at which point Tommy began telling his girlfriend that he planned on going swimming in the river that night. The bartender overheard him and said, "Tommy, you can't go swimming in the river anymore." But Tommy was a bit of a rule breaker and said he didn't care, he was going to go anyways. Tommy stood up, he grabbed his girlfriend's hand, left the restaurant, and began walking down towards the pier. When Tommy and Victoria got down to the pier, the black water was quiet and calm as Tommy took off his shirt and removed his valuables from his pockets. Right before Tommy was about to jump into the water, Victoria stopped him and said she thought she saw something moving underneath the pier. But Tommy just laughed and said he didn't care and jumped into the water and disappeared below the surface. Immediately, the water around Tommy seemed to erupt like a bomb had gone off underneath him. When Tommy came back up to the surface, he was screaming and trying to swim back to the pier, but before he could get there, something pulled him under the water. And then a few seconds later, Tommy came back up again, and this time Victoria could see the left side of his torso was bleeding profusely. And so she instinctively leapt into the water to try to save him. And Tommy, even though he knew he needed help, he said to her, "Get back on land, save yourself." And so she obliged. She climbed back onto the pier, and when she turned around, she caught a final glimpse of Tommy as he was pulled back under the water, and this time he did not come back up again. The bartender had heard screaming and so ran down with a flashlight to the pier. She raises her flashlight and she began scanning the now totally calm black water, and as she's scanning, she finds him. He's floating face down way off in the middle of the river, and as soon as the flashlight hits him, something pulls his body under the water and he disappears from view. It was no secret that the river that ran next to Alan's restaurant was home to alligators, but these alligators were small and they didn't bother anybody, and so the locals really didn't have any issues swimming with them. But on that day in June of 2015, when Alan and the other guests saw this thing out in the river, what they were seeing was a monster alligator, the likes of which they had never seen before in this river. It was at least 11 feet long and over 400 pounds, and that summer it decided to make the underside of Alan's pier its home. And so that night when Tommy leapt into the water, it was this monster alligator's feeding time, and so Tommy became its dinner. Tommy became the first alligator-related fatality in Texas in nearly 200 years.
July 5th, 2008, a 50-year-old man named David File walked up to his apartment in Bishopstoke, which is a small village in southern England. This apartment complex was massive. When David moved in 8 years earlier, this apartment complex was sort of bustling and doing quite well. It was a nice place to live. But now, the place was kind of fallen into disrepair. This place really had fallen on hard times, almost like it was abandoned. David was literally the last tenant in the entire complex. There were a total of 72 apartments in this complex, but 71 of them were boarded up and totally abandoned. And on this day, as David approached his front door, he noticed there was something taped to it, and he quickly understood it was an eviction notice. They were kicking him out. This was David's home. He loved it here. He did not want to leave. And so he took this eviction notice and he just threw it on top of a pile of other papers that were mostly all from the company that owned this complex. The company was called Atlantic Housing. Part of the reason this building had really fallen on hard times here is because 2 years earlier, Atlantic Housing had decided to tear this place down. They had offered to help relocate all the tenants, and basically everybody else had agreed to leave and take the assistance from Atlantic Housing, not David. Atlantic Housing got fed up with David. They just sued him. And it took 2 years. And so, David, you're being evicted. He just simply could not accept the ruling. David decides he's gonna protest. He made his way over to his storage closet, and he pulled out some rope, an electric timer, and a power tool, brought these supplies over to his living room, rigged up this elaborate trap that when they opened his door, they would have to be confronted by this trap. Earlier that afternoon, David's parents had tried to get in touch with David, and they had called him repeatedly, but he hadn't answered. At some point, they had driven over to his apartment, pounded on the door, but he hadn't come to the door. However, they had heard this strange sound. They decided to call the police. Still no answer. The police decide to kick in the door. All of them just froze and gasped. The trap that David had built had functioned exactly as he intended it to. The authorities were going to come in the front door and be horrified. He was sort of putting himself into a trap as a display of his protest that you can't pull me out of here. A power tool that was on, that was the mechanical whirring sound they heard, and it had been tied by David to one of the legs of his billiard table. And then the tool had this electric timer so that when it went off, it would start the tool. What was this tool? It was a chainsaw. What did David do? He intentionally positioned his neck right up against the teeth of this chainsaw, set the timer so that shortly after getting in position, the timer would go off, it would cut his head off, and then presumably authorities would look inside the apartment and see what, in David's mind, they were responsible for: his death. Shortly after his death, the apartment complex was demolished.
Lucas Holman was an incredible athlete, 6'3", incredible at baseball, football, and basketball, which was his primary love. In fact, he was so good in high school that he was recruited to play at a Division I program, the University of Wisconsin. And in fact, he got a scholarship to play there. So he went to the University of Wisconsin. When he wasn't getting much playing time there, it was at this time that he realized, you know what, I'm probably not going to play basketball professionally. And so he began orchestrating his life towards a career in finance. On September 29th, Lucas and his friends are at this huge German festival, drinking a ton of beer, having a great time. But at some point in the night, Lucas disappears. No one knows where he went or who he was with, but Lucas was a big, confident guy. They figured, you know, what's the worst that could happen to him? I'm sure he's fine. And so his friends ultimately just go home and don't think much of it. The next day, when no one could get in touch with Lucas, his friends and family called the police. The police went to the strip of bars and they asked to see the security footage from the night before. And in a very unfortunate coincidence, all of these bars, their cameras were down. So they weren't able to get a glimpse of where Lucas might have gone. On the 2nd of October, divers located Lucas's body. He was in 10 feet of water, about 20 feet from the edge. When they pulled him out, he didn't have any significant scratches or marks on his body to indicate some sort of altercation. It just looked like he had fallen in the water and drowned, and so his death was quickly ruled an accidental drowning. The initial medical report said that Lucas had fallen in the water and had been there for about 8 to 12 hours. So he'd only been in the water for a few hours, meaning there had been at least a few days where he was not in the water and was alive. In the toxicology report, it showed that he had a high level of alcohol in his system, as well as high level of this sedative called GHB. Also, it was noted that his belt buckle had been tightened way tighter than he normally wore it, and some people speculated that it looked as if someone else had tried to dress him, maybe after he was deceased or when he was unconscious. And then perhaps the strangest part of the case is the day after Lucas had gone missing, his roommate, who had been in the room the whole time, wakes up to an alarm. But it's not his alarm, it's Lucas's alarm. It's his phone going off that's underneath Lucas's bed. Lucas definitely had his phone while he was out, but somehow his phone got under his bed, but Lucas was not there and had never been there in the night unless he managed to sneak into the room without waking up his roommate and place his phone under the bed and then leave again. It didn't make any sense. Police would never subpoena the phone's records to find out where it went that night, so we're left wondering how in the heck it got under his bed if he was never in there. And where was Lucas from the time he went missing on the 29th of September and then wound up in the water at some point on the 2nd of October? A German doctor named Karl Heinrich August von Bureau was just opening up his private medical practice in East Prussia when a teenage boy burst in through the doors looking totally frantic. Before the doctor could ask any questions, the teenager blurted out that another boy in town needed his help right now. The teenager would say, "The boy is honking like a goose." For a second, Dr. von Bureau thought this might be a joke, but then he saw the look on the teenager's face, and he could tell he was very upset and very serious. So the doctor grabbed his bag, and he ran outside with the teenager, and they hailed a horse and carriage, and they told the driver to hurry up. When Dr. von Bureau and this teenager arrived at the honking boy's house, the honking boy's mother came running outside looking totally flustered, and she flagged down the doctor and then brought him inside her house. He got a look at the honking boy. He couldn't believe how terrible the boy looked. His face was all swollen and kind of bluish, and he was sweating profusely, and when the doctor watched him try to breathe in, not only did he honk, but also very clearly this boy was really struggling just to breathe. And so the doctor rushed over to the boy, and the doctor looked into his mouth, but there was nothing he could see that was blocking his airway. And so the doctor just put his finger into this boy's mouth, and he reached down inside, and suddenly he felt something lodged in the boy's throat that was small and hard, and he couldn't quite grab it. And so the doctor made a decision right then and there to perform an emergency tracheotomy, which is a surgery where you basically cut a hole in someone's neck in order to create a hole in their throat to let air go in.
But in this case, the doctor was just opening up his throat to try to get to this object. And when he looked inside the hole into this boy's throat, he saw the obstruction. It was like this pink, small, hard object. And so the doctor just reached in, scooped it with his finger, and pulled it out. And right away, the boy could breathe again. He was not honking anymore. It was obvious that this fixed the problem, but the doctor and the mother are just looking at this object, having no idea how to react to this because it made no sense. The object that was trapped in this boy's throat was a literal goose's larynx. The larynx is a hollow tube in your throat that helps you make sound. In humans, we call it the voice box. And right before this boy began honking, he was playing a game with his friends that involved taking recently severed goosenecks and blowing through them like they were trumpets. And at some point, as this boy was doing it, he began to cough for some reason, and on the inhale, during one of these coughing fits, he inhaled the goose larynx. And so that was why he sounded like a goose. He literally had a goose's voice box in his throat.
In central Texas lies a stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It's for daredevils that strap scuba gear on and dive down through Jacob's Well through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 chambers, and each of the chambers gets smaller and they get darker because you're losing sunlight, and they just become overall much more difficult to navigate the deeper you go. Any diver that's going to be in Jacob's Well has to be aware when you are in the second chamber on your ascent to not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is this opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber into the first chamber. But it's not. It's a dead end that loops around before you hit a wall, and you gotta go all the way back out. So hopefully you have enough air at that point. In 1983, 24-year-old college students Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 p.m. They were both experienced scuba divers. They were in an advanced scuba diver class with all the certifications for that. They had dove Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the 4th chamber. They went through that initial shaft into the 1st chamber. They continued into the tunnel that was the 2nd chamber. They wriggled their way into the 3rd chamber, and Richard Patton was the first one to go into the 4th chamber. He removed his tanks and pushed them inside of this opening, and then he began headfirst to slither inside of this 4th chamber opening while Clark waited. And Clark would later say that as soon as Richard had pushed his way and had actually made it into the 4th chamber, Richard comes screaming up back out of the 4th chamber. And Clark realizes that he doesn't have a mouthpiece in. He doesn't have scuba tanks on. Richard is desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold because he's dropped his tanks, and he's reaching for Clark to help him get pulled through this hole, and he can barely get out of this hole. And as soon as he gets free, Clark takes his mouthpiece off and he jams it into Richard's mouth. And so they begin buddy breathing. One guy breathes while the other guy holds his breath, and then they reverse that, back and forth, back and forth. So the pair calms down, and they're kicking their way up, and they get back into the 3rd chamber. They're kicking it out, and then their heads hit the wall. And they realize they've gone down the false chimney, and what's even worse is they hear that awful ka-tung, which means you have no air in your tanks. Clark, who had taken a full breath before this had happened, he immediately turns and starts swimming and manages to get out of the false chimney and makes it to the surface before he drowns. But Richard wasn't as lucky. His final few moments were spent in total darkness with silt kicked up all around him. He's got no air, he's got no idea where to go, and he's desperately trying to swim up, but he keeps hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. In 1898, a 12-year-old boy was playing at this river that ran near his house. He started to build a little dam in the river to try to catch some fish. And as he's building this thing up, he notices someone is walking down the river towards him. And he looks up, and it's a gentleman who shows up. He's wearing a nice suit. He walks over to Wofford and he says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the boy, he's like, "Oh, I'm making this fish trap." And he's like, "Man, that looks like a lot of work. You should take a break." And the boy's like, "Yeah, I guess I can take a break." And the gentleman just says, "Well, if you want, you can come to my house. My family's there. You can have a meal with us, and then you can come back and you can finish your fish trap." And so, this is a different time. This is the late 1800s. The boy felt compelled to say yes. He didn't want to be rude. They make their way up past the river into the forest a little bit, and they come up to this cabin. Now, the boy played in the woods here, and he had never seen this house before. But he's not too concerned, because as soon as he gets to the house, he sees that the lights are on and he hears kids playing inside, and a close family friend of his family's is sitting on the porch talking to one of the other apparently family members of the stranger. And he says hi to the family family friend, and the family friend waves back. The boy goes inside and he sees that this family has a couple of kids roughly his age. They're playing, goofing around. They have dinner, and the boy Wofford is like, man, this is so great. And after the meal, he lays down and falls asleep. And so he wakes up early the next morning and he feels horrible because he didn't mean to fall asleep and he didn't tell anyone from his family where he was going. And he's thinking, man, they're going to be so worried about me. And so as he's getting up to leave, the stranger is already awake, and the boy says, hey, can you walk me down back to the river? And the stranger's like, I can take you part of the way down, sure. And so as they're walking, they're passing by an orchard on one side and a cornfield on the other. And the boy remembers thinking how beautiful the setting was. But he also was thinking, like, I don't even know where I am right now. I'm assuming he's walking me back to where I live, but this doesn't look familiar at all. And the stranger stops. He says, hey, just go straight. You're going to turn down this way, turn back, and you'll be at the river again where we met. And the boy thanks the stranger, and the boy starts following the man's directions. And as he's walking, he's just suddenly curious and turns around to look back at this strange person who had brought him up to the house and then now brought him back. And he's stunned because suddenly the orchard and the cornfield are not there. There is no orchard or cornfield. It's just deep, dark forest. And he's like, what's going on? He turns back and there's a search party running to him. And he recognizes the family friend and you can tell they're like urgently looking for him. And he felt bad because he knows he slept over through the night. So he's like, hey, I'm here. And they're like, where have you been? And the boy turns to the family friend and he's like, didn't you tell them I was with you? And the family friend is like, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, at the house with family. We ate dinner together last night. And the family friend is like, I've been looking for you for the past several days. I've been with your family looking for you. You've been gone for 3 days. And the boy is like, what? And so the kid's terrified, but there's no answers.
In 1986, 35 million Americans went to see the brand new movie Crocodile Dundee. One of the 35 million Americans was a 24-year-old model from Virginia named Ginger Meadows. Ginger felt inspired to actually go to Australia to see it for herself. In March of 1987, Ginger hops on a plane and flies to Perth, and her plan was she would land in Australia and then work odd jobs and then use that cash to fund her travels all over the country. There had been this huge sailing competition in the city leading up to the weekend she arrived there. Maybe one of these boats could use an extra set of hands. And she stopped in front of the very first yacht she saw. And as it happened, the captain was actually looking for another crew member and they headed out to sea. Their next stop was going to be New Guinea, which was roughly 14 days of travel away. After about a week at sea, the captain realized they were dangerously low on fresh water. And so he decided to take a detour and head inland along this river system that would bring them to this large freshwater pool, which he also knew had this huge waterfall. So on the morning of March 29th, the captain anchored the yacht and then he lowered the yacht's dinghy. He, Ginger, Jane, and the rest of the crew, they hop in this dinghy, and then finally they get to this huge freshwater pool, and right in front of them is this amazing waterfall. They hold up their water jugs and they fill them with fresh water. When the captain thinks to himself, maybe it would be a good thing to stick around here for a little bit longer and maybe even hike up to the top of this waterfall, and everyone agrees it's a great idea, with the exception of Jane. And he and Ginger and the other crew members not named Jane climb out of the dinghy onto this cliff face. Everyone was able to do it except for Ginger. She kept slipping on the rocks. She abandons the idea and goes back down to the dinghy with Jane, and they're like, let's try to find an alternate way up to the top of this waterfall. And so the two women, they jump into the murky brown water and begin swimming directly across this pool towards this other cliff. And then all of a sudden, they hear their captain, who is now on top of the waterfall, screaming down to them to get out of the water right now. And they see there is this tidal wave of water coming towards them. It is a 12-foot long saltwater crocodile, and they're trying to climb up and pull themselves out of the water, but there's nowhere to grab onto. And they see this crocodile just staring at them with its mouth wide open. The crocodile does just close its mouth and sink below the surface. And this causes Ginger to completely panic, and she dives into the water off to the right and attempts to swim away from the crocodile back over to the boat. But Ginger only made it 2 strokes before the crocodile suddenly re-emerged underneath her and grabbed her by the waist and pulled her under the water. The crocodile re-emerges with its head pointed towards Jane, and in its jaws is Ginger. And Ginger's got her arms up over her head. She's wide-eyed. Ginger, again, was pulled back under, and this time she did not come up again. Ultimately, Jane would be rescued from the ledge, and then
about 2 days later, they would find what was left of Ginger's remains.
Snowy morning in 1972, 22-year-old Sotria Kritsonis sat at her bus stop in Seattle, Washington, adjusting her knit cap against the cold. The hat actually still felt pretty weird on her head because just a few days earlier, she had cut her brown hair super short. In fact, she'd deliberately worn this big hat to hide her haircut because this would make the reveal to her friends at school that much better. She glanced up Rainer Avenue for any sign of her bus, but there wasn't one. The city's public transportation system was all out of whack that day because of the weather. She'd already missed her first class of the day because of this bus, and now she was in danger of missing her second class. That's when she heard the beep of a car horn, and a pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle rolled up to the curb right in front of her. Tria had to squint through the snow, but she could see the silhouette of a man and kind of waving her over. Curious, she walked up to the now open window and leaned in. He was a good-looking guy in his 20s. He explained that he'd actually been driving on Rainer Ave for a while. He hadn't seen a bus in a long time. He offered to give Sotria a ride to her school. This is the 1970s, and hitchhiking at the time was pretty common. She agreed to get in because she knew it was her best chance at making it to school for her second class, and she was freezing. Tria sat back in the seat, and as she did, she looked out her window at the familiar route passing by. When she heard him turn on his blinker, he was preparing to turn right. And this struck Sotria as odd because, as she had explained to him, her school was a straight shot down Rainer Ave, and saw they were about to merge onto Interstate 5, which was definitely not the way to Sotria's school. She opened her mouth, but he cut her off, and he looked at her and he said, "It's a terrible idea to take a ride from a stranger." The man kept on talking, but Sotria was not listening at all. Instead, she was fixated on what he was doing with his right hand. He was fishing for something underneath his seat. Without taking her eyes off of this man, she traced with her hand and felt for the door handle, but she couldn't feel it. And then she turned and realized there was no door handle. It had been removed. Just then, the man stopped rummaging around underneath his seat. Whatever he was looking for, he had found it. But then, something strange happened. The man's face changed from determined and almost cruel to confused. The man told Sotria to take off her hat. And with trembling hands, she did as she was instructed, although she had no idea why he was asking. And when the hat was off her head, the man looked shocked. And he dropped whatever it was he had found back under his seat. There was a long, tense silence, and when the man finally spoke, he just said, "Why did you cut your hair?" The man immediately got off the highway and drove fast to Sotria's school. When they got there, he opened up the door for her and told Sotria to get out and said she was lucky. A few years later, in 1975, Sotria was watching TV when she saw a familiar face come onto the screen. It was the man who had given her a ride, being led into a courtroom in handcuffs. Sotria dropped everything and turned up the volume, and what she heard made her numb with horror. Because the newscaster was saying that this man who had given her a ride is a suspected serial killer accused of murdering dozens of young women who he would lure into his pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle and then bludgeon them to death with a crowbar or tire iron. And he had a very specific type when it came to identifying his victims. They were young women who all had long brown hair. This man's name was Ted Bundy.
In 2015, two men were driving at night when they spot what looked like a hunched over person in the middle of the road way off in the distance. As they got closer, they started hearing shrieking sounds in the woods all around them, and then they lost sight of the hunched over person. Feeling totally spooked, the guy in the passenger seat starts filming. Despite numerous attempts, this video has never been debunked.
Evening of December 27th, 1984, a 16-year-old boy named John Boulware sat in the passenger seat of his best friend's Jeep as they drove down a residential road in St. Paul, Minnesota. John's best friend was driving, and two more of their friends from school were in the back seat. It was dark outside, and it was rainy and kind of an awful night, but John didn't care. He and his buddies were on their way to see the megastar musician Prince perform live. Prince was obviously a massive star at the time. Prince was actually from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was just 20 minutes away from St. Paul, where they were from. But there was just something about seeing his hometown guy achieve his dreams on an international scale. It was just really inspiring. John, with all this excitement, he turns around to talk to his friends in the backseat. He hears a loud screeching sound, and he whips his head back around just in time time to see the headlights of the car aimed at this tree that they're careening straight towards. He screams, he hears his friends screaming, they smash into the tree, and everything goes dark. A few minutes later, a St. Paul police officer named Brian Coyle and his patrol partner pulled up behind the now wrecked Jeep. It's raining and dark out and visibility wasn't great, but right away he saw there were 3 teenagers who were standing upright outside of the car. Coyle walked up to these teenagers, and one of them, through tears, explained to Coyle that he had been driving, and then the driver said it didn't matter though how this happened, because what mattered now is his friend, John, is still in the car, and he's not moving. And Coyle, he knelt down and he looked inside the Jeep, and he saw the other teenager, John, slumped over inside the passenger seat. So Coyle asked his partner, hey, have you checked him? Is he okay? And the partner looked at Coyle and just said, no. He's dead. Coyle went back to John's friends and broke the news as gently as he could. Of course, they were all devastated. Once the ambulance had taken them away, and once John's body had been removed from the Jeep, Officer Coyle and his partner began to document the scene. About a week later, when Coyle and his partner were reviewing the photos they took, one of the pictures that Officer Coyle had taken was so bizarre. This is the photograph. And if you look at the top right, above the Jeep's open door, you'll see something that could just be a flash of light. But to Officer Coyle and so many others who have looked at this photograph, they say that weird apparition-looking thing above the Jeep looks eerily similar to John Boulware's face. And it almost looks like this photograph captured the moment of John's spirit departing Earth. It's showing his final moment in life when he died, screaming as the car is about to crash into this tree.
On April 3rd, 2023, a young man named Hemendra Marawi began opening up the presents that he and his wife had received at their wedding just a couple of days earlier. After opening up dozens, he was down to the last gift, and it was huge. Hemendra flipped it over a few times to see if he could find a card on it, but he couldn't find any notation on the outside. But he wasn't deterred. He just ripped open the wrapping paper and was amazed at what he saw. It was this beautiful, top-of-the-line home stereo system. Hemendra was so excited to use it that he pulled it out of the box, he plugged it in, but it didn't turn on. Instead, it exploded. It would turn out Hemendra's new wife had a crazy ex-boyfriend who was very unhappy she had gotten married. And so, on their wedding day, the ex-boyfriend had gifted the new couple a brand new stereo with a bomb hidden inside of it. Ultimately, the explosion killed Hemendra as well as his brother, who was home at the time.